Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started right now. First of all, I want to welcome you all to the Tattered Cover Bookstore, and thank you all for coming out, and thank you for supporting your local independent businesses, because it really does make a difference. Tonight, a couple things are going on. Just so you know, this particular presentation is being filmed and will be made available, I think probably through our Facebook page, the Tattered Cover Bookstore Facebook page, where other videos are. So just want to give everybody a heads up about that. And so I just wanted to mention that just so everybody knows. The other thing, I guess, as I think about this book, and I was talking with Priscilla earlier about, I was up really early this morning, reading the book and just loving it. I'm having an experience where I have, basically it's a book that I'm reading at exactly the right time in my life, and this is the exact right book I need to be reading. And it's just so perfect in so many ways. I'll let Priscilla talk about it, but the things that are really giving so much to me is just how much, as we go through all the things that we're dealing with in our lives, how much returning to nature, realizing how much we are part of this natural world, that we are part of the natural world, period. And when we realize that and we acknowledge that and we participate in the world in that way, how much that either gives us, rebuilds us, strengthens us, and also strengthens others as well. It's all part of a system. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm getting from the book. So many other things and so many other topics are touched on, so I'll let Priscilla talk. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Priscilla Stuckey.
Thank you, Derek. Can I take you on my book tour? This is a really special day. This is, as many of you know, this is my first book, and this is the first reading of my first book. So that means this is my first ever bookstore reading, and I couldn't be more thrilled that it's here at Tattered Cover in Denver, beloved of readers everywhere, a bookstore I've heard about for years, and I couldn't be more thrilled that you're the people that I get to share it with. So thank you, each of you, for coming out. And if I can't wipe the grin off my face, it's because this is such an exciting day. So thank you for being here. This book has a lot of different flavors to it. Each chapter flows between personal experience and our larger social experiences. And I was seeking to find the connections between those two things all the way along, walking that line between individual and social, between inner world and outer world. And so I'd like to read for about 20 minutes and give you a little bit of a feel, maybe, for that kind of movement. I'd like to read some pieces from the different flavors of the book. But let's start at the beginning. Midnight blue water rested at the horizon under a brightening sky, framing shafts of pine and fir at shore's edge. Here on the southern tip of Lopez Island, off the coast of Seattle, the dawn air was cool and still, the only sound a few songbirds calling far away. I headed across the needle-packed yard, toward a clump of pines. The bald eagle nest was right over there, Anya had said. She'd seen the chicks fledging just days ago, and they couldn't be far now. I turned my binoculars toward the pines, eager to spot that huge platform of sticks 3 to 5 feet across. I scanned the trees in one direction. Nothing. Puzzled, I looked the other way. No nest anywhere in sight. Soon my neck stiffened from the upward gaze. I lowered the glasses and headed across the thick carpet of pine needles. The eagles would have to show up soon. Anya had said they were here, so I might as well wait. It was 1995, and I'd met Anya just a few days earlier on a women's camping trip to Mount Rainier, a vacation from my too quiet life in Oakland, California, where I lived alone, writing a doctoral dissertation and editing books. A few years earlier, at 35, I'd undergone 3 severe losses, deaths of both parents, plus divorce after 13 years of marriage, followed too quickly by the end of a new relationship. And now I spent most days treading the waters of depression, withdrawn and silent. On the camping trip, Anya had been almost as quiet. Each morning she would unroll her yoga mat a few feet away from the group and stretch silently through her poses. We'd hardly said a word to each other. Yet on the last day, when the group gathered on soft emerald grass next to a tiny ripple of creek to share what we'd gained from the trip, and I said I'd love every minute of it, but still, in this prime bald eagle country, hadn't seen an eagle, Anya had urged me to follow her home. Her guest room was really a workout room, but I was welcome to unroll my sleeping bag there for a couple of nights and search for eagles by day. Climbing now over rocks near the water's edge, I gazed toward the deep blue of the sea. No eagles. I wondered how to find them. The thought occurred, why don't you call them? While meditating recently, I'd seen trees and birds in my mind's eye like watchful presences, but that was meditation, not real life. Birds don't just come when you call. Still, I was going to be here only until tomorrow, so there was no time to waste. I sat down on a soft bed of pine needles, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. Inside, thoughts ran wild. This is silly. They'll never show up. Might work for other people, not for you. I took another deep breath and settled into my body again, feeling alive in my arms, in my legs and feet. Noticing sensations was feeling, not thinking, a good way to turn off mental chatter. I brought to mind a picture of a bald eagle, that white head, fierce yellow eyes and hooked beak, the dark body, white tail, and powerful talons that could make off with a fish nearly half the bird's size. Please, I spoke mentally to the image, I'd really like to see you. Is it possible for you to hear me? In the background, I could hear another voice. Yeah, sure, right. Now you're praying to birds? Talking to someone you can't see who may not even be there? I breathed again. I'm only going to be here today and part of tomorrow. I've seen lots of birds, but never bald eagles. Please let me catch a glimpse of you. I remained quiet for a few moments, eyes closed. There was no more to do. I opened my eyes. The sun was far above the horizon now. I sat in its mid-morning warmth, gazing quietly at pines. How long do you wait for an eagle to come when you call? If you're impatient like me, not very long. A minute ticked by, then 2, 5, nothing happened. Trying not to notice a corner of disappointment, I stood up and headed toward the bike shop across the way. My chances of seeing eagles would increase, wouldn't they, if I covered the island? I picked out a bicycle and at the cafe next door stocked up on a sandwich, water, and apple. Map in hand, new Lopez Island visor peeking out from under my bike helmet, I headed out. The road I chose took me inland, and soon I was engulfed by peaceful summer gold fields stretching to the horizon, the sea no longer visible beyond their gentle undulations. Cars passed at a leisurely rate, each driver in turn lifting an index finger, not four fingers, not a palm, just an index finger, to greet me. Shyly, I waved back, unaccustomed after a decade of urban life to waving at strangers. I might have been back in the rural Ohio of my childhood. By late afternoon, my bottom was sore from the thick seam in my jeans, and my leg muscles were yelping. Drinking the last of my water, I worried that I wouldn't get back to my sleeping bag before dropping from exhaustion. Finally back at Anya's house, I finished the other half of my sandwich, soggy from the backpack. At dusk, Anya returned, as quiet as she'd been on the camping trip. I told her, no luck, I hadn't seen any eagles. She said, maybe tomorrow. I went to bed wondering what had gone wrong. I guess beginners don't get what they ask for, I thought. The next morning I would have time only to turn in my bike at the shop and head to the ferry landing for the return trip to Seattle and the flight home. The corner of disappointment had grown throughout the day and now threatened to take over. Up early again the next morning, I thanked Anya for the impromptu visit and took one last hike around the outside of the house. Binoculars in hand, I searched again for the nest. If an eagle nest is so obvious, why couldn't I spot it? I called again to the eagles. And please, I added, hoping I didn't sound too demanding, It has to be soon because I have to leave right now. At the bike shop, a guy in a baseball hat pointed to the best corner for hitching a ride across the island, so I headed there and stuck out my thumb. One car went by, then two. I tightened the straps on my pack and prepared for the 3 miles ahead. I was well out of sight of the hamlet, enjoying again the narrow road stretched between green and gold fields, before the next car approached. I turned and stuck out my thumb, and the small convertible pulled to a stop beside me. The woman driving waved me in cheerfully, and I hefted my pack over the side and settled gratefully down. Sun warmed the backs of our necks as we made our way north. We were now in the very middle of the island. No other cars passed us on the road. There were no trees nearby, and we were sailing past tranquil fields, our vision open to the sky. I glanced to the right and saw, far away across the fields, above the tree line at the eastern horizon, a tiny black spot in the sky. I ripped my binoculars from my pack and focused. Those spread wide wings. Closer it drew, a nearly invisible tail, a light-colored head. Over here! My silent call was more wish than thought. A head and tail of white materialized in the lenses. The bald eagle was headed straight toward us. "Could you stop for a minute?" I asked the driver. "Sure," she said, smiling, as she braked to a halt in the middle of the road. Still, the eagle approached on a course that would take it directly over our heads. What happened next made my heart stop, and does so even now, more than 15 years later. As we watched, the bald eagle, instead of flying over us and across the island, spotted the car below and, when it had arrived directly overhead, turned sharply to make a tight circle. I raised the binoculars again, eager for a closer look. There were the broad dark wings, spread white tail, pure white head. There were the sharp eyes trained on us as the eagle turned in orbit, shifting its regal head to stare directly down into the car. I watched, first with the glasses, then without. I had plenty of time to take in every detail, for the eagle, instead of making only one circle, was turning in many tight circles directly overhead. "Thank you," I whispered. "Thank you, oh thank you." My heart was rising in my chest, as if elation could lift it to the eagle's height. I watched until I couldn't hold my head up anymore. Only then did the eagle break orbit, beat its wings 3 or 4 times, and head back to the spot on the horizon from which it had appeared. On the 2-hour bus ride to the airport, my mind dwelled still on the eagle making its tight circles above our stopped car. When I got home, there would still be a dissertation to write, friends would still be scarce, and finances tight. But this one thing I knew: someone had heard my call. Something new was possible. The despair I had been fitted with, like a suit of family clothes, had been torn by a visit from another species. Although it would be years before the despair fell away completely, receiving a visit from the eagle nourished my growing sense of wonder. There was magic in the world, and it could be called up by sincere wishes sent out with respect. The eagle had answered at a time when few others in my life were responding. Perhaps the world was a friendly place after all. That a wild animal had come to my call was a smack to my consciousness. Something was afoot in the world, something that the best descriptions of that world, thought up by the most brilliant minds of the most modern society in that world, could not explain and did not even have words for. That the rest of the creatures are mute is, I have come to see, an article of faith, not a conclusion about the world reached through examining the evidence. Moreover, this view may not at all describe nature as it really is. In the 21st century, we are beginning to see that relying on a 400-year-old paradigm has also led us to the brink, perhaps beyond, of ecological disaster. If mind belongs to humans alone, then stones, trees, and streams become mere objects of human tinkering. We can plunder the earth's resources with impunity, treating creeks and mountaintops in Kentucky, or rivers in India, or forests in northwest North America as if they existed only for economic development. Systems of land and river become inert chunks of lifeless mud or mechanical runs of H2O, rather than the living, breathing bodies upon which we and all other creatures depend for our very lives. Not to mention what nature as machine has done to our emotional and spiritual well-being. When we regard nature as churning its way forward mindlessly through time, we turn our backs on mystery, shunning the complexity as well as delights of relationship. We isolate ourselves from the rest of the creatures with whom we share this world. We imagine ourselves the apex of creation, a lonely spot indeed. Human minds become the measure of creation, and human thoughts the only ones that count. The result is a concept of mind shorn of its wild connections, in which feelings become irrelevant. Daydreams are mere distractions, and nighttime dreams, if we attend to them at all, are but the cast-offs of yesterday's overactive brain. Mind is cut off from matter, untouched by exigencies of mud or leaf, as if the human mind were not like trees shaped by whispers or gales of wind, as if we were not like rocks made of soil. And then we wonder at our sadness and depression, not realizing that our own view of reality has sunk us into an unbearable solipsism, an agony of separateness from loved ones, from other creatures, from rich but unruly emotions, in short, from our ability to connect through sense and feeling and imagination with the world that is our home. We stand in self-decreed exile, having lopped off our awareness of the mind flowing through all creatures in this world, and so we are unable to know ourselves as kin with those creatures, participants in the same life permeating all. I shouldn't be surprised that the meeting that invited me into a new kind of life took place on an island. Islands are self-contained, or so they appear, separated from each other by often forbidding waters. They are exemplars of isolation. And yet we have that saying, too, that none of us is an island, all separateness and illusion. As nature philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore says, not even an island is an island. For every spot of land rides atop the deep fabric of earth and becomes a sign, as she says, a beautiful, rock-solid, bird-spattered sign of the wholeness of being, the intricate interdependencies that link people and places. Yet interdependence gets short shrift in our guiding stories, the stories that tell us at bottom how the world is. In the beginning was the atom. It was a story told by Democritus and his teacher Leucippus in Greece around 400 BCE. It's not the creation story we usually tell, but it might well be. The atom was separated from all other atoms by a great void. In truth, Democritus and his teacher probably didn't tell stories. Myths and poetry were the old-fashioned way, used by Homer and the bards to celebrate a living cosmos. Democritus and his generation were done with all that. They wanted precepts and principles, not stories about how the world worked. And so our isolationist tale took hold, first in ancient Greece around 400 BCE, then again at the dawn of the scientific revolution in Northern Europe 2,000 years later. It is a story of particle islands swimming in a formless, empty sea, a creation story that has taught its Western listeners to value separations and distinctions, and to view all of nature through the eyes of isolated individuals. A spoken story is larger than one unheard, unsaid, writes Chickasaw poet Linda Hogan. In nearly all creation accounts, she says, words or songs are how the world was created, the animals sung into existence. If words can bring worlds into being, what kind of world have we created from the story of atoms separated by a void? And what sense can we make of the fact that we have uttered words intended to erase stories, not create them? The scientific revolution was used to strip the animals and plants of subjectivity, to turn them into objects ready for human use. How can we understand this urge to sing the animals out of existence, to take away their stories? And in a sense, that question becomes the extended meditation of this book. And the answer or the alternative that I pursue and that I explore throughout the book is the alternative of a worldview based in relationship. Anyone can choose a worldview based on relationship. It is open to people of any faith or none at all. The pilgrimage is toward nature, and the practice is simply ones of cultivating relationships with those who are nearby. The oak outside the window, the soil that grows new life, the grass in the crack of the urban sidewalk. The simplest practice is taking time just to be in nature. And I don't mean packing your bags and traveling hundreds of miles away to visit some pristine wilderness. Connecting with nature need not mean leaving home, at least not in the geographic sense. The plants, birds, and rocks of the ground we inhabit offer a sustained experience of friendship. They are available on a daily basis to watch and wonder at, to learn to know as intimately as we would family members, and to develop a sense of kinship with over time. And if we open ourselves to respecting as friends the trees or plants or rocks in our backyard, we may find that we become travelers anyway, but of a different sort, cultural pilgrims at home. We may become willing to venture outside the bounds of everyday belief in the solidity and separateness of things. We may practice suspending, if only for a few moments at a time, the idea that nature works like a machine, and we may hold instead, if only for a few moments at a time, the idea that other parts of nature have their own awareness, their own will, and point of view. We might become willing to experiment, to try things that we have been told are impossible, to risk looking silly in order to follow a feeling or a hunch. And if we do all that, eventually we have stories to tell, as any returned traveler does, about the ways in which the world opened to our explorations, responded to our questions, and offered hospitality and gifts beyond any we could imagine. I'd like to close with a story of a gift that the red fox gave me. This was a fox that I got to know, a fox named Rudy that I got to know, whom I got to know when I was volunteering at a wildlife rehab center in the Bay Area. And it was my job one winter to feed the dogs at the center, meaning the resident coyotes and fox. And it was quite a procedure. You had to get them into their nighttime enclosures and get them out of their daytime enclosures into their nighttime enclosures, close the gates, and it was sometimes tricky. I squatted on the floor, waiting for Rudy to finish pacing. At last he had slipped inside the safety of his night pen, and I had dropped the gate to lock him in. Now his food bowl awaited. But would he approach it with me crouching only 2 feet away? The red fox and I had performed our usual evening dance. Me, stand just inside his night pen with my hand on the long rope leading to the gate. Rudy, race around the outside enclosure, dart into, then out of the night pen. Me, stand stock still. Rudy, creep up to the doorway, peer in. Me, don't breathe. Rudy, take 2 steps in, dart out again. Once he knew the staff person bringing him in, he slipped into his night pen readily, but until you had passed his friend test, he tried to keep his options open. I was safe with Rudy, or thought I was. Hand-raised by humans, Rudy was the darling of every staff person at the center and had never shown a hostile whisker to anyone. He was wary, like a good fox, but not unfriendly. Because Rudy seemed safe, I wanted to get closer. We were making good progress. Last week, as I squatted on the floor, he had padded softly toward me, sniffing. I stayed motionless, afraid I would spook him if I so much as breathed, while his pointed black nose probed the air just inches from my body. Tonight I squatted again, this time closer to his bowl. Soon Rudy was padding toward me again and sniffing. He made a slow circle around me, one moment almost touching, the next retreating. My knee on the ground was beginning to ache. How long could I stay propped in this position? Suddenly, he stepped directly in front of me. Then, without warning, he lifted one paw, put it on my lower knee, and, raising himself vertically, stared directly into my face. I gasped. I couldn't help it. I'd never been that close to the needle-sharp teeth of a fox. Captivity, I knew, makes people, and especially wild animals, crazy. Was Rudy planning to attack? After studying my face up close for a moment, he opened his mouth, stretched out his tongue, and with it reached between my parted lips. Startled, I made an effort to keep still. After licking the inside of my mouth for a few seconds, he withdrew his tongue, let himself down to the floor, and began gobbling his food. I'd just been French kissed by a fox. I was elated. I wanted to spit fast and hard, all in the same moment. A little dazed, grinning and working grit out with my tongue, I slipped out the door, leaving Rudy to his dinner. After that night, Rudy's kisses became de rigueur. I never did get used to that gritty tongue. He'd been rooting around in the earth and in who knows what, and neither did I get used to being French kissed by a creature who smelled more than a little of skunk. But neither did I catch any dread diseases. Only much later did I find out what Rudy was actually doing. Visiting a friend one day, I pick up a book on wildlife tracking and turn immediately to the chapter on foxes. There I read that newly weaned fox kits remain in their den while the parents go out and hunt. When one adult returns with food, the kits eagerly crowd around, trying to lick the parent's mouth, probing inside it with their tongues to see what mom or dad has brought for dinner, and stimulating the adults to regurgitate the food. Rudy wasn't kissing me after all. He was checking the menu. He must have wondered why I never coughed up the dog chow, dead mice, boiled eggs, and chopped fruit that appeared in his bowl. He was also greeting me as a fox greets a trusted member of the family. Years later, I still feel honored. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions, if you have any.
How did you become so interested and in tune to nature? Is it just come by you naturally, or did you learn it somehow?
I would say I had a contemplative bent from a small child. But as if you read the book, you find out that I didn't really connect with nature that much as a child, and neither did the people around me. It was when I was in my early 30s and I was ill with a chronic illness, and I found, and then went through all those losses, and all that suffering in the space of a short time meant that I had to find some keys, some tools that I hadn't explored before. Now, I was a meditator, I was studying religious studies, I had all kinds of tools. But the one big tool that I had never explored that much was nature. So I started walking in nature regularly. And it helped a little bit. And it kept helping. So I kept doing it.
Very nice.
So did you grow up in an urban environment as a child?
No, I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, northwest Ohio, 50 miles west of Toledo. A place that was originally one of the last deciduous swamplands, deciduous marshlands of the northern hemisphere. But the trees were cut down and it was drained and all in the 1800s. And so the ground was very flat and planted to corn and soybeans. And I lived at the very edge of our little village, and I looked out over an alfalfa field and sky. Yes?
I'm interested in the writing part and how is this an essay form, or how you went about choosing the right form for the book?
That's a good question, because at first I just had good stories to tell about animals and connections with animals, so I wrote a memoir. And I was very proud of myself after working on my memoir for several years, and I sent it off to an editor I knew for some feedback. And we got on the phone, and the first words out of her mouth were, "The most interesting part of this book hasn't been written yet." Not what you want to hear after you've worked for several years. I had no idea what else might want to be written. At first I was crushed by her words, but then curiosity kind of took over, and it was like, okay, where's the second half of this book, and what might it be? So she encouraged me to just write what came to mind, and I had a couple of writing teachers early in the process who advised to follow the image. So they were more fiction writers, but I thought, well, let's do it for creative nonfiction. Let's sit down and see what pops into mind and describe it on the page and then see what happens next. So that's how it unfolded.
I cannot wait to read this book. But my question is, I believe that people are craving this, and most people don't know what it is. I'm a musician and singer, and I notice as I'm more in that space of magic coming from my heart, that it affects people that hear my voice, which kind of is overwhelming at first when I think about it, but I think that people are craving this energy and they don't know what it is. So do you think that as we get in touch with the magic of whether it's music or nature, that can be a key to making a shift in terms of how we are connected?
I'm hoping it's one of the keys, definitely. And it's certainly been key for me, and I'm hoping that just by sharing my story of getting more in touch with the magic, that it has that effect of helping other people see the hope that's in all the living things right around us, very close to us. It's all there. Arts are a really powerful way to get in touch with that magic. This is a book of creative writing, which is a follow the image practice. I come out of academic writing where you follow the idea or the argument in your writing, and following the image or following the music or following whatever it is, whatever tool that an artist uses, is a way of getting beyond, getting to the wisdom and the magic that lies beyond the rational mind. So, more power to you. Good music to you.
What did it take to get your book into print?
Many, many years. So I wrote the table of contents in 2003, summer of 2003. Had the vision for the skeleton of the book. Began learning creative writing and putting down the stories from journals and from memory after that. 2008 was when the editor told me to start writing something else. By 2000, by the end of 2008, I had some okay stuff, and I started sending it out to find an agent, sending it out, with query letters to various agents. And I did that, fall of 2008 then was when the economic crash, so nobody was interested, so that meant putting on the back burner and waiting some more. Then in spring of 2010, I met my literary agent right at home in Boulder at a professional meeting one afternoon. One thing led to another, so she shopped it around and found the publishing home at Counterpoint Press in Berkeley. So once I got the contract, then it was time to actually write the second half of the book. And the writing went pretty fast after that. It was about 6 months of full-time writing after that.
How has the writing process changed you?
Oh, what a lovely question. It's like getting in touch with nature for me, that it increases my sense of trust in what is.
Say a little more about that, please.
Well, if you're not in control of the process, like a rational argument, like a thinking argument, if you're not in control of the process, you have to continually open to what wants to be said. And yes, it took plenty hard work. It took my rational mind too, to weave things together, to make aesthetic judgments in every paragraph, in every sentence. But the writing was at heart a process of listening. And as I watched it develop, I realized that there was wisdom there that I had never thought about before. It was beyond what I knew with my rational mind. And when you begin getting in touch with that magic and realize that there's a larger wisdom that wants to come through each of us, there's a larger wisdom that wants to be spoken through the uniqueness that is every one of us. And when you get in touch with yours, the magic takes over.
So were your original, you're a very lyrical writer, and you talk about having been an academic writer in your past. And so somewhere you made a transition. And what I'm wondering is, did the transition make you, or did you make the transition? So you're following, as you're saying, you're following. The language is so beautiful.
It was both. It was a back and forth. It was a back and forth. It was a conversation. It was a relationship, sort of, a relationship between my left brain and right brain, or between inner and outer worlds. And it was listening to that conversation. I do tend to be a linear kind of writer, writing things in order, but this book unfolded in a surprisingly linear way. I tweaked each paragraph as I went along, and it was like I couldn't move forward until I had perfected what was just written. And then once it was good enough to make me interested and happy with it, then I had the freedom to move into the next paragraph. So the process of writing, what I usually did was I got up in the morning, got to my computer, and reread the pages, reread that chapter, what had been written in that chapter up until that point, to kind of just get the process flowing. And once the process was flowing, then I would know what needed to come next. So it was very linear in that way, unusually linear.
So, Priscilla, do you think that the illness is part of what softened you and opened you to the lyrical writing?
Definitely. Although I was the kind of graduate student who cussed and swore at the academic writing all the way through. I was also a book editor, and so I was getting hours of practice every day smoothing the prose of other people's writing. And so once I had gone a certain number of years into the editing process, I could not be content with the way most academic things were written. But the process of being ill, and really losing my life. I mean, I had chronic fatigue syndrome to a degree where I spent months lying on my back staring at the ceiling of the room. And the fact that Western medicine didn't have tools that could help me, I tried all of them and none of them were efficacious. It cracked open my worldview, so that I was more open to doing things that might make me look silly, or to talking to plants, or to calling birds. I certainly would never have considered, well, I won't say that. I sort of had toyed with those kinds of things before becoming ill, but I think the process of illness really, by taking away my life, gave me many other things.
I appreciated what you said about how mythology animates us and our economies and businesses can come out of that. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Carolyn Casey. She's a visionary activist astrologer, and she also talks a lot about the need for mythology and for kinship instead of kingdom over, kinship with. I noticed you studied religion and feminist theory, I love that combination. Regarding our religious stories, I was wondering if you've seen this resurgence of evangelicals, for instance, are getting very interested in the creation care story instead of the dominator narrative. And I was wondering if you could speak to that hopeful trend.
The dominator narrative is not intrinsic to our religious texts. It is one way of reading those religious texts. And so I think it's a great sign of hope that people of faith, Christian people of faith, are reading the Genesis creation story in a much more, from a perspective of kinship and companionship and friendship and caring for the world around us. That's a marvelous sign of hope. And I know that Christian activists are working very hard in mountaintop removal issues in Kentucky. They're on some of the front lines in many of the environmental battles these days.
I remember as a kid, I would do these things where I would see a dog or something, and I would say, I don't know what I was, I think I know now what I was talking to, but at the time I would just say, if I saw a stray dog or animal, I would, I don't know, put light around it, or ask to put light around it, or something like that. And I understand now kind of what I was doing, working with energy and things like that. But I feel like I've always had an affinity with animals, and living in the city, it's easy to become disconnected from nature. But as you recommend, I've taken to walking just in where I live, which is right here. I walk right down, Detroit into Cherry Creek, but interestingly enough, the other day I was probably around 7th and I don't know, whatever, Detroit, and it's a very nice neighborhood, not very far from here. And there's a spot of grass and some trees in the middle, in the medium, and there's people jogging and walking their dogs, and it's very nice, well-to-do neighborhood. And nobody ever sits in these, nobody ever does, except for me. So I understand, sitting next to trees, and sometimes I'll put my arm around the tree, and I've had people look at me funny. Whatever, I don't care. But yeah, the other day I was sitting there on a Sunday afternoon and just had my eyes closed, and I get up to continue walking, and this woman, she walks towards me from across the street saying, "Are you okay?" And I just looked at her, she had this kind of busybody energy, and I said, yes, are you? And she said, well, I just normally don't see people sitting in the grass like that. And I said, okay. I didn't know what to say to her. And I said, okay. She said, never mind. And she was walking her dog. And so I thought about that, and I thought, why is it that that's so strange that in this, it's an affluent neighborhood. Why is it so strange to see somebody sitting in the grass? It's like everyone's on a mission to walk their dogs on a Sunday and show off their golden retrievers, and I love golden retrievers. I'm just saying everyone's like on this purpose.
Throw a party in that park, see who
should.
comes.
I could start
You can
singing,
all sit on the
like
grass
Rock
together.
Rusty if I started playing, my guitar or whatever.
Yeah.
I just thought, well, first of all, we're busybody, whatever, lady. And I thought, well, why was it? I don't know if you have any thought on that.
Well, it's an indicator of how separate we are from the ground around us. From another perspective, she was a teensy bit concerned about you. She did want your welfare, so or maybe.
But nothing was going on. I was just sitting in the grass. It's not like I was panting or, there was nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong.
A measure of how unusual it is for us to just sit on the ground that
She thought that
is
was
underneath
safe.
us.
Right.
It's private property, again, our conception of the world. Have you ever connected with a shaman by chance?
Sure, yeah.
I was in Peru a few years ago and took part in the ayahuasca ceremony. And there's a lot of, it was remarkable. It was challenging and remarkable at the same time, for sure.
I have never traveled elsewhere to do it, but I have run across people in the communities where I live.
Any more questions? Or why don't we again give Priscilla a round of applause. The things that we're dealing with in our lives, how much returning to nature, realizing how much we are part of this natural world, that we are part of the natural world, period. And when we realize that and we acknowledge that and we participate in the world in that way, how much that either gives us, rebuilds us, strengthens us, and also strengthens others as well. It's all part of a system. And that's one of the biggest things that I'm getting from the book. So many other things and so many other topics are touched on, so I'll let Priscilla talk. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Priscilla Stuckey.
Thank you, Derek. Can I take you on my book tour? This is a really special day. This is, as many of you know, this is my first book, and this is the first reading of my first book. So that means this is my first ever bookstore reading, and I couldn't be more thrilled that it's here at Tattered Cover in Denver, beloved of readers everywhere, a bookstore I've heard about for years, and I couldn't be more thrilled that you're the people that I get to share it with. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I think we'll get started right now. First of all, I want to welcome you all to the Tattered Cover Bookstore, and thank you all for coming out, and thank you for supporting your local independent businesses, because it really does make a difference. Tonight, a couple things are going on. Just so you know, this particular presentation is being filmed and will be made available, I think probably through our Facebook page, the Tattered Cover Bookstore Facebook page, where other videos are. So just want to give everybody a heads up about that. And so I just wanted to mention that just so everybody knows. The other thing, I guess, as I think about this book, and I was talking with Priscilla earlier about, I was up really, really early this morning, reading the book and just loving it. I'm having an experience where I have, basically it's a book that I'm reading at exactly the right time in my life, and this is the exact right book I need to be reading. And it's just so perfect in so many ways. I'll let Priscilla talk about it, but the things that are really giving so much to me is just how much As we go through all
The air was cool and still, the only sound a few songbirds calling far away. I headed across the needle-packed yard toward a clump of pines. The bald eagle nest was right over there, Anya had said. She'd seen the chicks fledging just days ago, and they couldn't be far now. I turned my binoculars toward the pines, eager to spot that huge platform of sticks 3 to 5 feet across. I scanned the trees in one direction. Nothing. Puzzled, I looked the other way. No nest anywhere in sight. Soon my neck stiffened from the upward gaze. I lowered the glasses and headed across the thick carpet of pine needles. The eagles would have to show up soon. Anya had said they were here, so I might as well wait. It was 1995, and I'd met Anya just a few days earlier on a women's camping trip to Mount Rainier, a vacation from my too quiet life in Oakland, California, where I lived alone, writing a doctoral dissertation and editing books. A few years earlier, at 35, I'd undergone 3 severe losses, deaths of both parents, plus divorce after 13 years of marriage, followed too quickly by the end of a new relationship. Thank you, each of you, for coming out, and if I can't wipe the grin off my face, it's because this is such an exciting day, so thank you for being here. This book has a lot of different flavors to it. Each chapter flows between personal experience and our larger social experiences. And I was seeking to find the connections between those two things all the way along, walking that line between individual and social, between inner world and outer world. And so I'd like to read for about 20 minutes and give you a little bit of a feel, maybe, for that kind of movement. I'd like to read some pieces that from the different flavors of the book. But let's start at the beginning. Midnight blue water rested at the horizon under a brightening sky, framing shafts of pine and fir at shore's edge. Here on the southern tip of Lopez Island, off the coast of Seattle, the dawn air, and now I spent most days treading the waters of depression, withdrawn and silent. On the camping trip, Anya had been almost as quiet. Each morning she would unroll her yoga mat a few feet away from the group and stretch silently through her poses. We'd hardly said a word to each other. Yet on the last day, when the group gathered on soft emerald grass next to a tiny ripple of creek to share what we'd gained from the trip, and I said I'd love every minute of it, but still, in this prime bald eagle country, hadn't seen an eagle, Anya had urged me to follow her home. Her guest room was really a workout room, but I was welcome to unroll my sleeping bag there for a couple of nights and search for eagles by day. Climbing now over rocks near the water's edge, I gazed toward the deep blue of the sea. No eagles. I wondered how to find them. The thought occurred. Why don't you call them? While meditating recently, I'd seen trees and birds in my mind's eye like watchful presences, but that was meditation, not real life. Birds don't just come when you call.